by our special guest, John Cross. John, how are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. Nice to be with you.
Thank you very much for joining us. And Mike, I got you as well, still gallivanting around London.
Yes, I'm making my ways around. Great win against West Ham last night. Good to get on the winning track. But without further ado, John, most of our listeners are from the U.S. and from the U.K. and scattered all over the world. So I'm sure there's familiarity with you. But you are, correct me if I'm wrong, the chief football writer for the Daily Mirror.
That's correct.
With a heavy focus probably on all things Arsenal, but you do kind of make your way around the entire Premier League and also the author of Arsene Wenger: The Inside Story of Arsenal Under Wenger, which is a fascinating read and kind of some insight into the to the inside story of Arsenal, as the book is called. So thank you for joining us on the podcast. Not a whole lot to talk about in the Arsenal world these days, huh? I mean,
it's been a busy few weeks, I must say. It has been. I do think that the win last night will have obviously been a huge, I think, relief. It's going to be an interesting end to the season, but I do think Arsenal so needed to win that game. And even when you consider that West Ham haven't been playing that well, being under pressure, I do think that sometimes with that in mind, it ramps up the pressure and puts a little bit more focus on it, and weaker teams crack. So I guess at least they're showing some spirit and commitment and getting the 3 points over the line.
Yeah, you never know what to expect, but that was well needed.
So, John, are you an Arsenal supporter, or are you just the go-to writer for the Mirror as Arsenal goes?
Well, listen, I think I'll be honest with you guys, in my job, I do think you can't really be a supporter. I think some of my colleagues who support, how can I say this without being incredibly patronising, but if you support a lesser team, I think you should probably get away with it. But I think if you support one of the big teams, I think if you make a big song and dance about it, I think your impartiality or lack of will always get called into question. Look, I basically, my dad was born and brought up on Blackstock Road, and basically, Arsenal, in the family, and I spent my life sort of as a kid going home and away. But I do genuinely think when you are in this job, you have to be much more impartial, call it as you see it. And people might even say that perhaps sometimes I'm a little bit more critical with Arsenal than other clubs. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it's a difficult balance to keep in this job.
Absolutely,
I imagine, and so it's in your DNA. We can see that, but of course, impartiality comes first in the line of work that you're in. So, John,
with there being so many different platforms for supporters to read sports news, what or how do you do to try and set yourself apart or get that story first? Is it just the connections that you have being in the role, or how are you trying to fight off all these different media platforms nowadays?
Well, it is an interesting challenge, and I do think you kind of try to use your contacts. Look, I basically, my time linked with Arsenal dates back years, and it goes back to local paper days when I was on the Islington Gazette, and as a sort of a trainee reporter, and just unbelievably, some of the people who were around in those days still there. I went to the screening of Rocky and Righty Remembered on Friday night at the Emirates, and I'll be honest with you, it's brilliant to see so many old faces who I kind of know from old, from like obviously Gary Lewin to kind of Ian Wright himself to kind of Paul Davis to Terry Murphy, who sort of obviously worked with the kids, and him. It's just brilliant, and so it's a great connection to have, my sort of friend Lynn who works on sort of the front office. It's great, and it is a nice sort of kind of connection to have, and you can't help but feel it's a club with a lot of family history, but it is something that you can't obviously let sway. I think the one thing is what I would say is about Arsenal is that it's an interesting time because I think up until 10, 15 years ago, it's very much a family club. You felt you knew everyone around the club. Since they moved to the Emirates, it's become a big business. It's become corporate. It's become a huge employer of staff. And it's not quite so personal now. I think the challenge now for the club hierarchy, and I don't mean the board when I say this, but the people who run the club, so Ivan Gazidis down, I think it sort of kind of is to try and keep that personal touch amongst staff. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the thing. I'll slightly digress from the original question, which was kind of the connections. But look, I do try and keep up, obviously, relations and kind of, have contacts. I like to think I can sort of drop the odd sort of kind of story. I mean, Ospina being out this week, being a case in point, maybe. We managed to get that sort of out first and kind of, there's a story some fans won't want to read, but Martinez did quite well all the same. And it's just, stories like that. And obviously, I'd like to think that I kind of got a bit of an inside track on Arsene Wenger and potentially staying. I know that's going to divide opinion, but, you like to think that down the years you establish a name and a reputation and hopefully, gain a reputation for it going quite well.
Right. So you mentioned Gazidis in there, and I just wanted to ask, so you recently wrote that article, Arsene brands the talk of Arsenal needing a major overhaul amid catalyst for change as superficial hot air. But that came off of the back of Gazidis kind of releasing the little press statement that he did. So do you feel like that highlights the overall issue at Arsenal? Shouldn't the board and manager have that unified front from that perspective?
Well, of course they should, but I don't know, that they do. I think that's a challenge, really, really do. So I think Ivan Gazidis wants to drive some change and improvement. I think that's very admirable because I think the season has been disappointing. I think Arsenal slipped behind slightly. They finished second last season. I personally think they're quite a long way short of the title race this season. And I think that it's admirable. I think that they want to kind of do something. They really want to. So, I personally think, that I think they need to make improvements for Wenger to stay on and be successful. I don't know whether it's such a great idea for Wenger to stay. I do think that the things have got a little bit stale and maybe they need a change. It's a difficult atmosphere at the moment. The fans were fabulous on Sunday against Man City, getting behind the team. I think sometimes people lose sight of that because they see, a few people protesting outside or whatever. In the ground, it's brilliant, and the fans deserve so much credit. I still feel that it's difficult to thrive in those circumstances.
Yeah, and some of the issues that we keep seeing repeat and rear their heads with Arsene Wenger are in his off the field management, the decisions that are made in the summertime in January, and we have a listener, Tom Rosenhammer from Richmond, Virginia, who sent in a couple questions for you because he is an avid reader of all things John Cross. So he had a question about N'Golo Kante this summer because apparently Arsene came out and said a few weeks ago that we lost out on him because Chelsea outbid us. But they spent $32 million on him, and a couple months later, we spent $35 million on a center back, admittedly a different player, but a far less impactful one. So was it wages that separated us, or did we just not share the valuation of Kante as a $32 million player or £32 million player?
Well, I'll tell you what, it's a tricky one, this one, because I felt that Arsenal wanted to sign a box-to-box player and in Xhaka rather than a sort of a defensive shield in Kante. Now, I didn't think that's what Arsenal needed, so, make that absolutely clear. But I think Wenger knows Kante's agent well and knew that he, I think, would have a great chance of getting him. But he obviously, at that point, didn't feel that was maybe what the team was needed. They looked at him earlier in his career, and I think sometimes to be convinced a Premier League club as big as Arsenal want to see how he does at a smaller Premier League club, and so they'll take that gamble, and if it costs them more, it costs them more. But I think that Kante wanted a lot of money, £200,000 a week, and I don't know whether Arsenal would have paid that for a defensive line midfielder. I think maybe when Wenger talks about being outbid, I think you're talking about wages as much as the fee, because obviously they spent more on Xhaka, let alone Mustafi.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be my reading of the situation. But I think it's a huge miss, big mistake. I think it's one of the few recently.
And who sets those limits? To say, okay, well, the 200,000. I mean, obviously, in relation to the other top players, it bends the structure. But who is it that has that final say? Is it the board? Is it Gazidis, Wenger, a combination?
I think it's a bit of a combo, really. I think that the Wenger wants to. I think they run a tight ship. I think that basically it's difficult for Arsenal to kind of bear it out and sort of see it out. So it's a tight ship. They've got to run their wages tight. I think they've made Ozil an astonishing offer, but then they know that everyone else will come knocking if they sign up Ozil. So I think when people sort of say, "Oh, kind of break the bank," well, you can only break the bank so far because they do run a tight ship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the same thing may have happened based on recent comments from Xabi Alonso from a few years ago as well. Just one of these small differences that ends up with a player not coming. So the allure of Arsenal. We're kind of at a crossroads here, because if we fail to finish fourth this year, and assuming Arsene Wenger stays, and there's not a new project with a new manager bringing over players like an Allegri, for instance, maybe we lose Alexis this summer, or potentially on a free the following summer. But is the magic of being in London and playing for Arsenal going to be enough to lure top players here anymore, or are they just going to want to go to where the money and the recent titles have been in Chelsea and City?
Well, you have to remember, don't you, that basically Arsenal signed Sanchez in the first place when Liverpool were offering more in terms of fee and contract, because Sanchez wanted to come to London. I personally don't think that Arsenal will sell to Chelsea, a direct rival to Sanchez.
Oh God!
So whether he goes or not on the free is another matter. But that would be my view. But I think London's a big attraction, and I think so is the Champions League. So if Arsenal miss out on the top four, that would be a blow. Having said that, I think Tottenham moving to a stadium perhaps might not be able to attract, but Chelsea can financially. So.
And then there's Sutton.
Rebuild, in my view.
There's Sutton, Sutton as well. That could take a few away from us, like they already have.
I think Arsenal need a squad rebuild. I do, and so it'll be a really interesting challenge. They need to make changes behind the scenes. I think Wenger will stay. And sign another 2 year.
You've answered the question that we were going to ask. Obviously, we'd be foolish to not talk to you and ask that question. But
look, I do. I don't think it's a certainty. I've seen some stuff that's wrong, that he's signed, he hasn't. But the 2 year contract on the table. It's been on the table since early in the season. I think he'll sign it. I think Gazidis wants to drive change. It's an interesting point. But
do you think the? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, that was it. Go on, tell me.
Do you think the change will be just on the pitch, or are you hearing anything about potential backroom staff change with maybe a director of football coming in, maybe a change with some of the coaching staff, things of that nature?
Yeah, I think he'd like. I think that they would like him to change the backroom staff. So maybe a new coach to change things up a bit. I think a director of football in the longer term, guys, I would say. I think there's been a bit of a sort of a misreading of this. My understanding is that Dick Law, the sort of kind of current transfer fixer, won't be leaving immediately. But I think in the longer term, and perhaps this is part of the succession planning over the next 2 years, I think the director of football will be phased in, I think. And as Arsenal look to appoint a manager to succeed Wenger in 2 years' time, of course, if he doesn't settle for another contract, then I think then basically I think that's all part of the succession planning. I think it's good planning. We could talk all day about the rights and wrongs of Wenger staying on, but I think the importance is, in 2 years' time, should he go, I think they've got a real succession plan. Right now, I don't know that they do have such a succession plan, but I think they are planning for the future, and it's the right way to go.
And he's always said he wants to leave us in better position than most coaches leave them, or than he found us, I guess. And it certainly doesn't seem like where we are at this moment in time, if he left, that he'd be accomplishing that goal. But the question is he stubborn enough that he just thinks he can get us out of this by more of the same, or will some changes be done? And this is a kind of a crass question, but you mentioned changes in the backroom staff and the coaching. But I've heard a number of people ask this question and never gotten a good answer. What does Steve Bold do? I think that's unfair on Steve Bold, because I think Steve Bold is a really good coach. I think they're more personal. We don't see behind the scenes, which is probably where it mostly comes from. So.
Well, I think that's so unfair, because I think the more pertinent question is what is Steve Bold allowed to do? Arsene Wenger, is the boss basically, and then I think that I don't know how much Steve Bold is allowed to do. That's the more pertinent question. I think a bigger figure. Would it work? Would Wenger really embrace Thierry Henry as an assistant manager? I'm not so sure, really. But at least it would be a fan pleaser. But I don't know if you can impose coaches on a manager. It rarely works. Look at Brendan Rodgers in his final season at Liverpool. They changed up the structure for him. He can't have been happy with that, I feel. And
Louis van Gaal and
departed shortly. Yeah, and
those two didn't seem to really get along very well.
You employ a manager, you have to let the manager manage. And I think that there has to be some meat in the middle. I've got total sympathy with what Gazidis is trying to do, but I can also see it from Wenger's point of view. I think there's got to be some sort of compromise.
All right. Well, that has been some fantastic insight. I've enjoyed the time that you spent with us, John. We really appreciate you taking the time and coming on with us today, and be following your Twitter and your articles to see what happens in this crazy time we're going through.
Guys, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope by the end of the season we'll be in a better place. And I promise to come back on if you'll let me, and I'll give you much more time, especially as we can perhaps overview the season, and then looking forward to the future. Really appreciate your time. And
thanks, John.
Yeah, we'd love to do that. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
All right, John. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
No worries.